Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. We are still in Pelopidas. The Theban generals that were sent into Thessaly did nothing but, being either unskillful or unfortunate, made a dishonorable retreat, for which the city fined each of them 10,000 drachmas, and sent Epaminondas with their forces. The Thessalians, inspirited by the fame of this general, at once began to stir, and the tyrant's affairs were at the verge of destruction. So great was the fear that possessed his captains and his friends, and so eager the desire of his subjects to revolt, in hope of his speedy punishment. But Epaminondas, more solicitous for the safety of Pelopidas than his own glory, and fearing that if things came to extremity, Alexander would grow desperate, and, like a wild beast, turn and worry him, did not prosecute the war to the utmost, but, hovering still over him with his army, he so handled the tyrant as not to leave him any confidence, and yet not to drive him to despair and fury. He was aware of his savageness, and the little value he had for right and justice, insomuch that sometimes he buried men alive, and sometimes dressed them in bears' and boars' skins, and then baited them with dog, or shot at them for his advertisement. At Meliboea and Scutassa, two cities, his allies, he called all the inhabitants to an assembly, and then surrounded them and cut them to pieces with his guards. He consecrated the spear with which he killed his uncle Polyphron, and, crowning it with garlands, sacrificed to it as a god, and called it Tacon. And once seeing a tragedian act Euripides' Tyrades, he left the theatre, but sending for the actor, bade him not to be concerned at his departure, but act as he had been used to do, as it was not in contempt of him that he departed, but because he was ashamed that his citizens should see him, who never pitied any man that he murdered, weep at the sufferings of Hecuba and Andromache. The tyrant, however, alarmed at the very name, report, and appearance of an expedition under the conduct of Epaminondas, presently dropped like a craven cock his conquered wing, and sent an embassy to entreat and offer satisfaction. Epaminondas refused to admit such a man as an ally to the Thebans, but granted him a truce of 30 days, and Pelopidas and Ismenias, being delivered up, returned home. Now the Thebans, understanding that the Spartans and Athenians had sent an embassy to the Persians for assistance, themselves likewise sent Pelopidas an excellent design to increase his glory, no man having ever before passed through the dominions of the king with greater fame and reputation. For the glory that he won against the Spartans did not creep slowly or obscurely, but after the fame of the first battle at Leuctra was gone abroad, the report of new victories continually following exceedingly increased, and spread his celebrity far and near. Whatever satraps, or generals, or commanders he met, he was the object of their wonder and discourse. This is the man, they said, who hath beaten the Lacedaemonians from sea and land, from confined that Sparta within Taugetus and Eurotas, which, but a little before, under the conduct of Agesilaus, was entering upon a war with the great king about Sessa and Ecbatana. The pleased Artaxerxes, and he was the more inclined to show Pelopidas attention and honor, being desirous to seem reverenced, and attended by the greatest. But when he saw him and heard his discourse, more solid than the Athenians, and not so haughtily as the Spartans, his regard was heightened, and, truly acting like a king, he openly showed the respect that he felt for him, and this the other ambassadors perceived. Of all the other Greeks, he had been thought to have done Antalcidas, the Spartan, the greatest honor by sending him that garland dipped in an unguent which he himself had worn at an entertainment. Indeed, he did not deal so delicately with Pelopidas, but, according to the custom, gave him the most splendid and considerable presents, and granted him his desires, that the Grecians should be free, that Messenia inhabited, and the Thebans accounted the king's hereditary friends. With these answers, but not accepting one of the presents, except what was a pledge of kindness and goodwill, he returned. This behavior of Pelopidas ruined the other ambassadors. The Athenians condemned and executed Timagoras, and indeed, if they did it for receiving so many presents from the king, their sentence was just and good, as he not only took gold and silver, but a rich bed and slaves to make it, as if the Greeks were unskilful in that art. Besides, 80 cows and herdsmen, professing he needed cow's milk for some distemper, and lastly, he was carried in a litter to the seaside, with a present of 4 talents for his attendants. But the Athenians, perhaps, were not so much irritated at his greediness for the presents, for Epicrates, the baggage carrier, not only confessed to the people that he had received gifts from the king, but made a motion that instead of 9 archons, they should yearly choose 9 poor citizens to be sent ambassadors to the king, and enriched by his presence, and the people only laughed at the joke. Well, they might have a better idea with what the general public needs done, right? But they were vexed that the Thebans obtained their desires, never considering that Pelopidas's fame was more powerful than all their rhetorical discourse. Within a man who still inclined to the victorious in arms, this embassy, having obtained the restitution of Messenia and the freedom of the other Greeks, got Pelopidas a great deal of goodwill at his return. At this time Alexander the Pheraean, falling back to his old nature and having seized many of the Thessalian cities, put a garrison upon the Achaeans of Phthiotis and the Magnesians, the cities. Hearing that Pelopidas was returned, sent an embassy to Thebes, requesting succors and him for their leader. The Thebans willingly granted their desire, and now when all things were prepared, and the general beginning to march, the sun was eclipsed and darkness spread over the city at noonday. Now when Pelopidas saw them startled at the prodigy, he did not think it fit to force on men who were afraid out of heart, nor to hazard 7,000 of his citizens. Therefore, with only 300 horse volunteers, set forward himself to Thessaly, much against the will of the augurs and his fellow citizens in general, who all imagined this marked portent to have reference to this great man. But he was heated against Alexander for the injuries he had received, and hoped likewise from the discourse which formerly he had with Thebe, that his family by this time was divided and in disorder. But the glory of the expedition chiefly excited him, for he was extremely desirous at this time, when the Lacedaemonians were sending out military officers to assist Dionysius, the Sicilian tyrant, and the Athenians took Alexander's pay and honored him with a brazen statue as a benefactor, that the Thebans should be seen alone of all the Greeks, undertaking the cause of those who were oppressed by tyrants, and destroying the violent and illegal forms of government in Greece. When Pelopidas was come to Pharsalus, he formed an army, and presently marched against Alexander, and Alexander, understanding that Pelopidas had few Thebans with him, and that his own infantry was double the number of the Thessalians, faced him at the tedium. Someone told Pelopidas, the tyrant meets us with a great army. So much the better, he replied, for then we shall overcome the more. Between the two armies lay some steep, high hills about Kynocephala, which both parties endeavored to take by their foot. Now, is that pronounced Kynocephala? Kynocephala. How is that spelled in Greek? But both parties endeavored to take by their foot. Pelopidas commanded his horse, which were good and many, to charge that of the enemies. They routed and pursued them through the plain, but Alexander meantime took the hills, and charging the Thessalian foot that came up later, and strove to climb the steep and craggy ascent, killed the foremost, and the others, much distressed, could do the enemies no harm. Pelopidas, observing this, sounded a retreat to his horse, and gave orders that they should charge the enemies that kept their ground, and he himself, taking his shield, quickly joined those that fought about the hills, and advancing to the front, filled his men with such courage and alacrity that the enemies imagined they came with other spirits and other bodies to the onset. They stood 2 or 3 charges, but finding these come on stoutly, and the horse also returning from the pursuit, gave ground and retreated in order. Pelopidas, now perceiving from the rising ground the enemy's army was, though not yet routed, full of disorder and confusion, stood and looked about for Alexander, and when he saw him in the right wing encouraging and ordering his mercenaries, he could not moderate his anger, but inflamed at the sight and blindly following his passion, regardless alike of his own life and command, advanced far beyond his soldiers, crying out and challenging the tyrant, who did not dare to receive him, but retreating, hid himself amongst his guard. The foremost of the mercenaries that came hand to hand were driven back by Pelopidas, and some killed, but many at a distance shot through his armor and wounded him, till the Thessalians, in anxiety for the result, ran down the hill to his relief, but found him already slain. The horse came up also, and routed the phalanx, and followed the pursuit a great way, filled the whole country with the slain, which were above 3,000. No one can wonder what the Thebans then presented should show great grief at the death of Pelopidas, calling him their father, deliverer, and instructor in all that was good and commendable, which is what you need to encourage people about, good and truth, right? Nothing beside. But, that's not quite the case here, right? But the Thessalians and the allies, outdoing their public edicts, all the just honors that could be paid to human courage, gave in their display of feeling yet stronger demonstrations of the kindness they had for him. It is stated that none of the soldiers, when they heard of his death, would put off their armor, unbridle their horses, or dress their wounds, but still hot, with their arms on, ran to the corpse, and, as if he had been yet alive and could see what they did, heaped up spoils about his body. They cut off their horses' manes and their own hair. Many kindled no fire in their tents, took no supper, and silence and sadness was spread over all the army, as if they had not gained the greatest and most glorious victory, but were overcome by the tyrant and enslaved. As soon as it was known in the cities, the magistrates, youths, children, and priests came out to meet the body, and brought trophies, crowns, and suits of golden armor. And when he was to be interred, the elders of the Thessalians came and begged the Thebans that they might give the funeral. And one of them said, "Friends, we ask a favor of you that will prove both an honor and a comfort to us in this our great misfortune. But the Thessalians shall never again wait on the living Pelopidas, shall never give honors of which he can be sensible. But if we may have his body, adorn his funeral, and inter him, we shall hope to show that we esteem his death a greater loss to the Thessalians than to the Thebans. You have lost only a good general, we both a general and our liberty. For how shall we dare to desire from you another captain, since we cannot restore Pelopidas?" The Thebans granted the request, and there was never a more splendid funeral in the opinion of those who do not think the glory of such solemnities consists only in gold, ivory, and purple, as Philistus did, who extravagantly celebrates the funeral of Dionysius, in which his tyranny concluded like the pompous exit of some great tragedy. Alexander the Great, at the death of Hephaestion, not only cut off the manes of his horses and his mules, but took down the battlements from the city walls, that even the towns might seem mourners, and instead of their former beauteous appearance, look bald at his funeral. But such honors being commanded and forced from the mourners, attended with feelings of jealousy towards those who received them, and of hatred towards those who exacted them, were no testimonies of love and respect, but of the barbaric pride, luxury, and insolence of those who lavish their wealth in these vain and undesirable displays. But that a man of common rank, dying in a strange country, neither his wife, children, nor kinsmen present, none either asking or compelling it, should be attended, buried, and crowned by so many cities that strove to exceed one another in the demonstrations of their love, seems to be the sum and completion of happy fortune. For the death of happy men is not, as Aesop observes, most grievous, but most blessed, since it secures their felicity and puts it out of fortune's power. Well, divine decree, but, what, one, chooses amongst one's opportunity. Well, and that Spartan advised well, who, embracing Diagoras, that he himself had been crowned in the Olympic Games, and saw his sons and grandchildren victors, say, "Die, Diagoras, for thou canst not be a god." And yet who would compare all the victories in the Pythian and Olympian Games? No, I don't know how those are spelled, so I don't. I don't know. We have the English, not the Greek. Put together with one of those enterprises of Pelopidas, of which he successfully performed so many, having spent his life in brave and glorious actions, he died at last in the chief command for the 13th time of the Boeotians, fighting bravely and in the act of slaying a tyrant in defense of the liberty of the Thessalians. And, people think they change their fortune, but they change the track that they were on, because, again, their opportunity, which is their destiny, was something that they actively chose. You think something's your destiny, it's not. Like all these people, "Oh, we're soulmates and I could only have this one person." It's like, well, no, it doesn't work like that. Perhaps you only had one good opportunity in life, but they usually don't mean it like that. It's usually some shallow emotional thing. Now there's deep emotion based on something other than, but anyways, that's for another point. His death, as it brought grief, so likewise it produced advantage to the allies, for the Thebans, as soon as they heard of his fall, delayed not their revenge, but presently set 7,000 foot and 700 horse under the command of Alcetus and Deogiton, and they, finding Alexander weak and without forces, compelled him to restore the cities he had taken, to withdraw his garrisons from the Magnesians and Agaans of Phthiotis, and swear to assist the Thebans against whatsoever enemies they should require. This contented the Thebans, but punishment overtook the tyrant for his wickedness, and the death of Pelopidas was revenged by heaven in the following manner. Pelopidas, as I have already mentioned, had taught his wife Thebe not to fear the outward splendor and show of the tyrant's defenses, since she was admitted within them. She of herself, too, dreaded his inconsistency and hated his cruelty, and therefore, conspiring with her 3 brothers, Tisiphonus, Patholaus, and Leucophron, made the following attempt upon him. All other apartments were full of the tyrant's night guards, but their bedchamber was an upper room, and before the door lay a chained dog to guard it, which would fly at all but the tyrant and his wife, and one servant that fed him. When Thebe therefore designed to kill her husband, she hid her brothers all day in a room hard by, and she, going in alone, according to her usual custom, to Alexander, who was asleep already, in a little time came out again, and commanded that the servant be led away with the dog, for Alexander wished to rest quietly. She covered the stairs with wool, and the young men might make no noise as they came up, and then, bringing up her brothers with their weapons, and leaving them at the chamber door, she went in and brought away the tyrant's sword that hung over his head, and showed it them for confirmation that he was fast asleep. The young men, appearing fearful and unwilling to do the murder, she chid them, and angrily vowed that she would wake Alexander and discover the conspiracy, and so, with the lamp in her hand, she conducted them in, and they, being both ashamed and afraid, and brought them to the bed. When one of them caught him by the feet, the other pulled him backwards by the hair, and the third ran him through. The death was more speedy, perhaps, than was fit, but in that he was the first tyrant that was killed by the contrivance of his wife. I'm sure it's not the first, and his corpse was abused, thrown out, and trodden underfoot by the Pheraans. He seems to have suffered what his villainies deserved, and perhaps it's just the initial one in the Greek memory, well, in Roman memory too,